Hey guys, it's Goosebumps Completionist, and today I'm bringing you my final Goosebumps Most Wanted book review. And it's book number 5, Dr. Maniac Will See You Now. Yeah, I hate this book, y'all. I'm gonna be up front. This is one of the worst Goosebumps books I have ever read in my life. This was agonizing from start to finish. You know, in the Dr. Maniac franchise, right, there's 3 books. The first book, Dr. Maniac versus Robbie Schwartz. I read the second, because I didn't know They Call Me the Night Howler was a Dr. Maniac book, and I read that one first, but we'll get into that in just a minute. Dr. Maniac versus Robbie Schwartz has its clear flaws, but I don't outright hate it. I think that there's a lot about it to like, but it just arrives at that not good but not bad for me. I can totally understand if you hate it, though. They Call Me the Night Howler. I've heard people compare it to Shadow Girl from the Nightmare Room and call it a discount Shadow Girl. That might be a fair statement. I have yet to read it. But that book just wasn't scary, but it captured my inner child and my inner comic book fan. And then this book just accentuates not only the sins of Dr. Maniac versus Robbie Schwartz, but the sins of Most Wanted as a whole. I brought this up in my previous review with Planet of the Lawn Gnomes. I think Planet of the Lawn Gnomes opened my eyes to the big picture of what Most Wanted is and how it tries to go about its stories. And this one just takes the cake for just throwing everything at the kitchen sink at you from the get-go. And I don't think anything stuck with this book. I almost physically hate everything about this book. Almost. There are some things I like about it, but they're really small things. Like, things that don't really matter that just are like accents in the story. And I'll get to that near the end. But yeah, this book was rough. This was a real rough one, y'all. I'm going to be honest. So let's get into the plot overview without giving too much away. Yeah. So, story starts off with this kid named Richard. He's a 12-year-old kid. People call him Richard Sneezer because he has an allergy problem and he constantly sneezes. And people are grossed out by him because he gets snot everywhere. And when he starts sneezing, he can't stop. And the story kicks on one day. He's in his classroom. And he's having this daydream going on. And then his teacher wakes him up from his daydream. And calls him to come to the front of the class and present something. But as he's coming into the front of the class, he has a sneezing attack and sneezes all over his teacher. And then his teacher tells him to sit down. And everybody stares at him and makes fun of him. And you get a sense that Richard's not the most popular kid at school. He's kind of made fun of for having something he can't control. Which, you know, is sympathetic. You know, you don't want to see a kid get bullied for something he can't control. And, you know, the kids really just pester him and make fun of him. He has this crush on this girl named Bree. And Bree even laughs at him. You know, he's kind of come to grips that he's just not, he's not cool. And it's really sad. It's just really sad to read. And, you know, he's trying to leave school and his bullies, you know, knock him down on the sidewalk. And he sees his parents' car waiting for him. And he gets in the car. And this is where you meet his parents and his brother Ernie. And there's a revelation that he's about to be taken to a new allergist that's across from his favorite museum called the Comic Book Museum. And this is a place he frequently goes. And he talks about his comic book collection in his monologue, which is kind of intriguing. You're like, okay, he's a comic book fan. There's a comic book museum. You know, I've read Night Howler before. I'm like, okay, where's this going to go? But then you hear the things coming out of the parents' mouths towards Richard. And these, without a doubt, without a shred of doubt in my mind, have to be the worst Goosebumps parents of all time. Not only are they complete jerks to their own son, some of the stuff that dad says to him, I'll let you read it for yourself. But it's terrible. The mom kind of sticks up for him, but she babies Ernie, the little brother, and the little brother makes some really offhanded remarks to him as well. And, you know, it's like, I understand, these parents shouldn't be parents. They should actually get a divorce because they also, not only when they're not making bad comments about the kids, or about Richard, they're fighting. And they're being really toxic. And, you know, that environment is just really bad. It just sets the tone for the rest of the book. Like, what am I reading? But they take him to this allergist. This new doctor named Dr. Root has a like I said, a clinic right in front of his favorite comic book museum. So he goes there, and he goes and sees Dr. Root, and Dr. Root pulls out this huge needle that he's going to jab into his back, and he presumably faints. But when he comes to, Dr. Root said, "Hey, you fainted, but hey, you got a shot, and this should help you with your allergies. Your allergies should be taken care of." So he gets taken home. He goes to the comic book museum, and he meets the front desk clerk, and the front desk clerk and him have this good relationship, and he gives him these two really rare comics called the Masked Monkey, or Masked Monkeys or something. And there's only like two known to exist, and he wants Richard to read them. So Richard wants to go read them in the reading section, but it's closed, and he has to get going. So he takes them home with him in hopes that the clerk won't get mad at him. So when he gets home, you hear some more of pretty much abuse by the parents to Richard. It's hard to read, like I said. And you get a little more of a taste of how Ernie's a spoiled brat. Richard sets his comics carefully down on his bed, and Ernie tries to take the comics, and Ernie gets spoiled. You really have to, understand what Richard's going through here. But after all that happens, this girl that he has a crush on named Bree comes over and reveals to him that, hey, while you're having a daydream earlier, the teacher put us as a project partners, and we should work on a project together. But even Bree's terrible to Richard when she says, I don't want people to know that we're project partners. I can't be seen in public with you. And poor Richard is like, I'm okay with that. Hey, I'll do the project for both of us. And she's like, really? He's like, one condition. We're going to do it on comic books, and you got to meet me tomorrow at the comic book museum. So, reluctantly, Bree has no choice but to do it. Now, for some reason, the next day comes around, and they go to the comic book museum. And Ernie has to be with, Richard because he has to watch him. His parents were all fighting. They have to go do something. So Richard goes there, and then, or maybe, he loses sight of Ernie, and then Ernie and Bree come in. I forget how it is. But anyways, Richard, Bree, and Ernie are at the museum. And when they get in there, they realize no one's around. And then they start seeing these characters from the museum have come to life. And they have no idea how this is happening. And this is where you meet Dr. Maniac. Dr. Maniac does this whole thing like, I'm a maniac. And tries to keep the kids hostage, saying like, you can't go anywhere, blah, blah, blah. The comic book world seems to have merged with the real world. And the kids are like, you can't be real. You're a comic book character. And they go into this whole thing. Dr. Maniac tries to tie up Ernie, and Richard takes some feathers off of his, textbook yellow boots with feathers and tickles them in his chin, and it gives them a distraction enough to get away. And they escape. They leave the museum, and they head back to Richard's house. They're like, hey, we need to go back to my house. Something's wrong. And when they get there, they see that Richard's parents are caged up by these two villains, and they're like a frog-themed villain, and his sidekick. And they have to go through this whole thing with them. There's a thing dealing with a jar of flies that Ernie has that kind of gets him out of the situation. And they're all able to escape, and they leave Richard's parents behind. And Bree's like, I'm done with this. This whole time she's like, I want to leave. I don't want to be a part of this. And then she's like, well, maybe my parents can help. And when they get to Bree's parents' house, they see this bug monster outside of the house. All the lights are off. The bug monster sprays them with this gunk, and it makes Richard vomit. And there's two scenes where it explicitly talks about Richard vomiting. Gross out for the sake of being gross out, right? And then we meet the Purple Rage. Purple Rage, he's in all these Dr. Maniac books. And the Purple Rage comes out and doesn't want to help him. He's like, he says all these cringy kind of things. But Purple Rage, he's not his best here. But he does have some funny moments throughout the story. The first joke he makes is kind of funny. Talking about the kids smelling bad. And then they get kind of caught up with the Purple Rage, and they're like, hey, well, we got to go figure out how to get back into the comic world. And Purple Rage is like, okay, let's do that. So they head back to the museum, and when they get there, they get having this encounter with Dr. Maniac, who's stayed behind. And there's also other superheroes flying around. You see all these scenes with superheroes and stuff. But anyways, Dr. Maniac takes Ernie and disappears. And Purple Rage gets upset and moves the front desk where they were at and finds this trap door. And they all decide to go down into the trap door because that must lead to the comic book world. So they all try to go down this trap door, and Richard gets separated from Purple Rage and Bree. It falls down into icy cold water, presumably the ocean, and he has this thing with these squid monsters, and like I said, I have thalassophobia, so that kind of got to me a little bit. And once he's able to get out of that situation, he tries to swim over to this island, but it turns out to be this sea monster, and he falls down into the belly of the sea monster, and he's very much down there with rotten fish left, to be digested. And then he realizes the Purple Rage and Bree have also been swallowed, and Bree's like, I'll never forgive you for this, And Purple Rage gets so mad that he explodes, and it shoots both kids out onto this island. And what seems like the most random scene in this whole book, but it's actually the best scene, is you see there's a scene with Bree. She thinks her leg is broke, but her leg got blown off. I'm not kidding. The book says her leg got blown off, completely detached. What? And Richard's like, well, we are in the comic book world. And then they start getting this idea that, wait, since we're in the comic book world, anything can happen. So Richard decides to take her leg and reattach it, because they can do whatever they want, apparently. And that supposedly fixes her leg, but now she has a limp. And they start wandering on this land that they're on. And they come across this place. They hear screaming, and they venture into where they hear the screaming. And they venture to this doctor's office. And Richard's like, well, since we're at a doctor's office, let's get you help. And the front desk lady is the Scarlet Starlet. You might recognize her from other, Dr. Maniac books. And she's the receptionist. She's like, oh, the doctor's in right now. And they hear screaming, and then they go and investigate what the screaming is. They think that it might be Ernie who got lost. But is Dr. Maniac just practicing his screaming? And then it's like, Ernie, where are you? And he comes out of this closet. So when that happens, then let's just say the Purple Rage comes back, right? And the Purple Rage has now decided to side with Dr. Maniac and the Scarlet Starlet. And the doctor from earlier, the doctor that, put the shot in Richard's back, is there and says, hey, you're having a big old dream. And I'm like, oh, please don't let this be all of a dream. This will just be the icing on the cake for this book. And, of course, Richard does a test and realizes that, he was lying. And the doctor's like, his name is Dr. Root, right? And he's like, you're right, I am lying. I'm actually the root of all evil, and I'm partners with Dr. Maniac. So now you have the root of all evil, Dr. Maniac, the Purple Rage, and the Scarlet Starlet all coming after Richard and Bree and Ernie. And Richard says to them they need to escape, because he comes up with this idea that since he's a comic book character now, that if he sneezes, he can have a superpower. He can use his sneezing ability. And then he discovers that he has super sneezing. So when he sneezes, it blows people back with I don't know, G-force winds, and gets the villains far back enough to where he can escape. But when he's escaping, he's having difficulty finding, Bree and his brother Ernie. So he beelines for the ladder that's supposedly about to close and shut him into the comic world forever. And he has these close calls with Dr. Maniac and the rest of the group. And he tries to make it up, and he realizes the door is closed, were closing, so he tries to sneeze to keep the door open, and he keeps the door slightly open. And he looks up from the trap door and he sees his family. All of the superheroes have gone back down to the comic book world because they thought the real world was boring. And his parents are fighting, and and he's looking at his parents, and Bree's up there, and Bree's like, I'm never gonna forgive you. And he's sitting there thinking about his life, about how sucky it is in the real world. So he decides to leave himself behind in the comic world. And he falls down. He's like, I'm going to be a superhero. And then the ending happens, where you figure out what's going to happen with Richard. And I'm not going to spoil it, but that's essentially Dr. Maniac. We'll see now. I didn't mention this, but I guess we'll start off in the positives. I didn't mention this in the plot review, but there's some things in the story that I can really appreciate as a comic book fan, right? This middle school that Richard attends is called like Hugh Jackman Middle School. There's streets in the story called like Kirby Street after Jack Kirby. There's a lot of love letter type of things to comic book actors and comic book creators in this that I can really appreciate. Another positive I like is like Purple Rage sometimes in the story. Purple Rage kind of makes these books funny and lighthearted in a way. He has some funny ones in this book, but some are hit or miss, and they don't really do a lot with them in this book. Nothing really too scary with them, just really kind of mad, but he has his funny moments. And this book surprisingly has some good scenes in the comic book world, like with Bree's leg getting blown off. That's insane. That's insane. Oh, like that's gory. There was no blood description, but that was gnarly. I'll give the book that. It had some edge at times. But other than that, where do I begin with this book? I guess I'll start off with the negatives. I guess I mentioned Richard as a negative. He's not really a negative, but I hate how his character is treated in this book by not only his peers, but by how the story wraps up at the end. If it didn't end on that, I probably would put Richard as a positive. He has these heroic traits. He's kind of a one-dimensional character. Kind of feel sorry for him, but never really shines through like maybe like Robbie Schwartz or like Mason. I like Mason a whole lot more. He's just a really weak protagonist, even in Dr. Maniac books. So, yeah, and how he's treated by his family. Not getting to one of the bigger negatives. Almost every single character, supporting wise, in this book is terrible. Outright sucks. Bree is terrible. Ernie sucks. The parents are god awful. I have never hated almost every single character in a book in Goosebumps before. This is, the characters are some of the all-time worst of all time. The main villains, Dr. Maniac, the Scarlet Starlet, Purple Rage. It's always, I guess it's fun to see them. Dr. Maniac is just kind of cringe to me. I think these first two books in Dr. Maniac, especially with Robbie Schwartz in this one, he just comes off a little more cringe. Purple Rage is hit or miss. He's more of the funnier one. But Scarlet Starlet is she's just kind of there here. And overall, with the whole villains, I just felt kind of meh with the story. I was just like, whatever. This is just a nonsensical kind of rehash of Robbie Schwartz. And a lot of this book is essentially just a rehash of Robbie Schwartz. But the element of it being very linear in that there's a comic book world and then there's a real world is very, astute in this book. As in Robbie Schwartz, it keeps going in and out of comic strip. Is it reality? Is it not? It does that a whole lot more in that story. So there are some differences, but for the most part, it's just keeping all the sins Robbie Schwartz had. A lackluster reveal, lackluster twist, kind of chopping his plot. It doesn't really feel like an all for nothing book, but it's just not one that you want to see. Richard deserved a way better ending than that, especially how he was treated the whole book. Which, you can make that argument about some other characters like Heidi from Jekyll and Heidi or Jackson from Son of Slappy, but genuinely awful family. He deserved better than that. I'm sorry. it's not enjoyable as I guess some of the other ones can be. You know, with similar sympathy. You know, given their home life and stuff. Um, yeah, and then misused tropes. That's another negative I have. Misused tropes. This whole concept, right, about the comic book world is that the kids can do whatever they want because it's a comic book world. But that's a dream trope. That's not a comic book trope. That's a dream trope. And it makes me think back to comics, right? I'm like, well, comics still obey by general reality rules. Spider-Man just doesn't turn into the Hulk because he can. He has limitations. You know, he has specific powers, right? He just doesn't come up with these things because he's in a comic. You don't just become a superhero. You have to get bitten by a spider. You have to be born a mutant. If you come from the real world and you're put into the comic book world, that makes no sense how you would have powers. It's a misused dream trope that really makes no sense. And I'll give Stein credit. I don't even think he wanted it to make sense. It's just supposed to be kind of dumb. But yeah, that whole concept with the whole comic book world was not done smart, and it could have been way better. But it just exists there, and it's kind of yeah. And then I said it before in the Dr. Maniac versus Robbie Schwartz review, but this book definitely leans into feeling like a parody of comics than actually paying respect to comics. Like I said, there are some things that pay respect to creators and actors. But after that, it goes full on parody. I'm just flabbergasted how Stein has this idea about comics. You know, he writes comics, right? He's written comics before. And he thinks of comics as these over-the-top silly things. I mean, there are some silly comics, but superhero comics are not this cornball in this fashion. I mean, maybe back in the day, maybe back in the Adam West days, and maybe that's where he's getting inspiration from. But it just feels like you're making fun of comic book fans, you're making fun of comics, and it makes me feel kind of ashamed to be a comic book fan to read something like this. It has, like I said, a lot of the similar issues Dr. Maniac versus Robbie Schwartz had, and yeah, this was not good. From a 0 to 5 star basis, essentially, just for the characters alone, how much I hate them, I deducted 2 points off. Yeah, the most I've ever deducted for characters. I hate almost every single character in this book, from the lackluster treatment of the villains, from the treatment of Richard, kind of how one-dimensional he is, sympathetic but not that great, and then all the supporting characters just are terrible. It's already down to a 3. And then I deducted essentially for, you know, the crappy idea with the comic book world misusing tropes, using dream tropes in the place of comic books. That makes no sense. I don't know, just the cornballness nature, the parodic nature to this whole story. And everything. It's just really bad. And I deducted another 1.5 off from 3, so now we're down to a 1.5 out of 5, which puts this book in the F tier. Yeah, I think this is the first non-Give Yourself Goosebumps book I gave an F tier. I think I've only given 2 Goosebumps books as of now an F tier. This is a pretty bad book. Okay, it's pretty terrible. And for F tiers, I only give 1s, 1.5s, and 2s. And if I'm willing to give something upwards of a 2.4, I might as well just give it a D- out of 2.5. So a 1.5 is kind of a middle tier F. It has some redeemable things about it, but they're so small and minute, they're not significant things, and they don't really hold their weight to me. And I think what doesn't save this book is the terrible characters. If this book actually had good characters, and maybe had a better idea with the comic book world, I would have been, I probably would have liked this more. But we got what we got, and it's pretty terrible. So, that's my thoughts on Dr. Maniac. We'll see you now. Let me know down in the comment section. Do you love this book, or do you hate this book? I'm dying to know, and I'll see you next time.